Hello, lovelies. Welcome back to Pretentious Waffle, the series in which I allow myself to be a little bit experimental, self-indulgent, incautious. This is where I let my thoughts roam free like an escaped lab monkey, accosting people in the streets to tell them about this unified field theory he's worked out and flinging poo at reform voters. Today we're going to talk about something that I think we all instinctively know, at least I hope so, but we don't always put into words particularly eloquently, he said haltingly. Pop culture is better when it respects its audience, and it doesn't tend to do that much anymore. Not only respects its audience, but challenges, educates, and inspires, rather than simply pandering, or talking down to, or treating people with kid gloves like they can't handle complicated or challenging ideas. Now, before you get your hackles up, yeah, I still mean it, even when it's just for fun, because fun has lots of different meanings. The best fiction, the best pop fiction, is better when it at least tries to be something more. When it tries to be clever, even smart-assed, and doesn't treat the audience like idiots, savages, weaklings, or children, even or especially when the audience is children. Some of the best, most long-lived children's fiction is stuff that kind of treats kids like mini adults who can handle more than you think they could. Now, a lot of my personal examples as we go through this are going to come from comics, because through the mid to late 80s, through into the 90s, very much centred on what was called the British invasion of comics, itself echoing the British invasion of pop music in the 60s. But in that period, the maturation of comic books was very influential in my thinking on this and my experience growing up. Not that other things weren't, it's just that this is where my mind goes when I consider this topic. It's where the influences on me largely come from. So, let's start with Grant Morrison, a man whom I suspect might actually be some sort of 4D entity experiencing time in a non-linear fashion, but that might just be the drugs talking. His or mine, I'm not sure, but it's probably the drugs talking. Morrison's work is deeply informed by modern occultism, chaos magic, the history of radicalism in all its forms across politics and culture, and by art movements like surrealism and Dadaism. The Invisibles isn't just a great comic, it's part of what Morrison calls a hyper-sigil, a comic as a magical working, designed to change reality itself, which seems ambitious for a comic book to me. I think other comic books have done it better without intending to, V for Vendetta, for example. But that's not just me talking. Morrison himself has said as much, and ideas from or incorporated into his work, like the concept of barbalith, like fiction suits, like sigils and wank magic and so on, have at least been popularized, if not invented, in his work. It's a sprawling narrative, The Invisibles, of secret societies, countercultural warfare, consciousness expansion, blending real-world esoteric knowledge with strange storytelling and conspiracy theories before that kind of warped our politics and became associated with the far right. If that wasn't enough, some of his older works, like Zenith, combine a deconstruction of the superhero mythos, a uniquely British one, with a uniquely British political and musical history, layering the narrative with cultural post-war references to British culture and the aftermath of Nazi occultism, with a hefty dose in the later cycles of obscure and forgotten British comics. The whole thing that he does here rewards those who are willing to explore beyond the surface. And it even has the Bond villain-esque Super Rich as an antagonist in part of it, long before Musk was ever a gleam in his hair surgeon's eye. Then there's Doom Patrol, which doesn't just reference the bizarre art movements of surrealism, Dadaism, but embodies them in many ways. It challenges the idea of what a superhero story can be, weaving together literary illusion, philosophical concepts, and experimental storytelling into something that respects the reader's intelligence and curiosity. Even his more mainstream work like Batman Arkham Asylum and his run on JLA showcases Morrison's belief that fiction should elevate as well as entertain. It doesn't always hit, but the effort is always appreciated. His Batman is a detective and an esoteric warrior first, not just a crime fighter, and he incorporates elements of psychology, myth, and philosophy into that. His book, Super Gods, is a must-read, I think, for anyone who engages in any way with the superhero or vigilante sort of genre. Then there's Alan Moore, the arch-wizard of Northampton. Moore treats research almost like a sort of religious obligation. He lives kind of an almost monk-like existence, isolated from the internet, surrounded by books and papers, working on whatever takes his fancy, which is an enviable position to be in. His instructions to his various artistic collaborators borders on the obsessive in its detail, and I think you have to have a certain amount of mental fortitude to deal with that. His League of Extraordinary Gentlemen is one gigantic literary Easter egg hunt, pulling characters and references from every corner of fiction, starting with the Victorian era, but delving both backwards and forwards in its multi-layered synthesis of many different fictive worlds. He brings them all together into one unified world, which is kind of the opposite of the more typical comic book obsession with multiverses. Here he's creating a unitary universe from things that are far flung across the literary sort of genre. He also incorporates the politics, the social structures, and many of the linguistic quirks of the time periods that he chooses to explore in those volumes of the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, which move forward and backward in time. Each volume isn't just a crossover event between all these different and disparate characters. It's an education in Victorian and pulp literature, things that probably most people other than Moore have forgotten about. Moore assumes his audience is smart enough to appreciate it, and rewards them more for doing their homework, for picking up on the references, sending people down rabbit holes, treasure hunts, through our literary past to better appreciate the main body of his work. From Hell, for example, is practically an historical textbook on the Victorian era, written in comic book form. It meticulously reconstructs London in the late 19th century, interweaving Masonic conspiracies, class struggles, medical advancements of the time. It's not just about Jack the Ripper, it's about the context of and around the Ripper murders and why they resonated so much in that period. Even his work on something so seemingly ridiculous as Swamp Thing didn't just reinvent a horror superhero character, it elevated the entire genre of comics by treating ecological horror with intellectual depth and pulling from folklore, environmental science, and mythology. So he turned a generic skulking swamp monster into a philosophical meditation on identity, nature, and humanity's relationship with the earth, where a lot of lesser storytellers trying to follow on the coattails of a lot of the British invasion of American comics just made things darker and weirder without any appreciation as to why or any further depth to it, which is a shame. His magnum opus in Watchmen is often lauded for its deconstruction of superheroes. But what makes it truly enduring is the depth of its storytelling. Every panel, every word choice, the whole thing is meticulously crafted, which is why I think it pisses him off so much when it becomes bastardized. He drew from Cold War politics, comic book history, imagining a different world, and drew from existential philosophy and psychology. His work as a whole challenges readers to see fiction as something more than just escapism. He has a similar but different, more traditional, in some ways, magical approach to storytelling. And this seems to be a weird obsession for many comic book creators, especially British comic book creators. I don't exactly know why, but I have talked about it on other videos, trying to figure out for myself why that should be the case. For me, at least, Moore's work captures perfectly what I mean by work being able to be about politics without having to be necessarily political per se. Moore is, above all, a consummate storyteller, massively well self-educated in fiction, very, very broadly. And while he certainly has a point of view, and that point of view is expressed in his works, that of a very grumpy and very particular kind of British anarchist, his work can still be enjoyed by people whose own beliefs are antithetical to his, even if it really pisses him off that people like Rorschach. So, yeah, elevating your work can make it appreciable to different people than even the people you intend. And you don't have to be obnoxious and blatant when you do it. Warren Ellis takes a different approach, but with a very similar ethos. Transmetropolitan, which is his magnum opus, I think, at least so far, is Hunter S. Thompson with cybernetics and biotechnology. It's a grotesque love letter to muckraking journalism and that sort of golden, weirdly, Nixonian age of punching the establishment in the face with facts, logic, graft, and vast amounts of drugs. It's easy to see Spider Jerusalem as just being an exaggerated take on gonzo journalism. But Ellis pushes further, integrating internet culture, media manipulation, bleeding-edge scientific and technological theory, and societal decay all into the mix, even predicting the kind of information overload and the sheer amount of exploitation and bullshit we have to put up with from the internet, now, but written years ago. Transmet is pretty prophetic, predicting the rise of algorithm-driven news cycles, online mob mentalities, and political corruption with eerie accuracy, and that's kind of always been Ellis's bag in a lot of ways. Beyond Transmet, Ellis's Planetary series serves as a sort of archaeological dig, both in the narrative itself and in the comics themselves, through comics culture, in a similar way to the way in which Moore explores literary history in The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. He treats pulpy adventure fiction and superhero tropes with a historian's reverence, both inside and outside the storylines. It doesn't just reference classic sci-fi horror and mystery, it dissects it, explores why these stories matter, what things might be like without them, or if they were different, what they mean to us. His Global Frequency comics are an anthology of bleeding-edge science and espionage at the time, presaging the squandered potential of the smartphone we all carry with us all the time. My one has the ringtone from the aborted Global Frequency TV series on it still. Probably well as long as I can keep the file. That was an interesting one. Yeah, that squandered potential, that idea, that positivity of what smartphones could mean, and then what they've become. In a lot of his narratives, he taps into real-world emerging technologies long before they become mainstream, sometimes predicting what they'll do for the good, sometimes predicting what they'll do for the bad, sometimes just what they'll do indifferently. The man doesn't just write fiction, he conducts a sort of hypothetical field research on the impact of technologies, bringing the strangest, most fascinating aspects of our world and subcultures into his stories without really watering them down. I was on a panel on T-Shirted Historians show last week, where we welcomed our guest, Sandy Peterson, known best in these circles for his work on Call of Cthulhu. No discussion of pop culture that respects its audience would really be complete without noting the influence of the Cthulhu mythos. And Sandy Peterson's work on Call of Cthulhu really helped kickstart the rediscovery of Lovecraft way back when. Peterson didn't just create a tabletop RPG, he reshaped horror tabletop gaming by emphasizing atmosphere, investigation, madness, and existential dread over combat. He took H.P. Lovecraft's cosmic horror and translated it into mechanics, most especially the sanity mechanic, that made players feel vulnerable, encouraged them to think about things and to run away instead of just rolling dice and swinging swords or shotguns. We discovered through that conversation that Chaosium's Lovecraft game was set in Lovecraft's lifetime in the 1920s because they weren't that confident in Lovecraft being a strong enough brand to sell on its own and regarding him as something of a hack. So by setting it in the 20s and 30s, they felt that they could incorporate flappers, gangsters, prohibition, early cinema, all of these kind of things that they felt gave a stronger foundation for a game than just overblown descriptions of gribbly tentacle monsters. Despite this horrible disrespect to Lovecraft himself and his craft, this turned out to be another example of elevation, albeit somewhat unintentional, because Call of Cthulhu as a game then became a history lesson as well as a game. And it began to demand a little bit more of players, keepers, and game designers to properly represent that period of history, or to at least try to. Lovecraft himself, despite his flaws, crafted a mythology that continues to challenge and provoke readers, and asks some pretty eternal questions about the relevance of humanity in an enormous and uncaring universe. Ironically, given as we now see his fiction as historical, Lovecraft himself was thoroughly modernist in a lot of ways. For all that he invoked some of the weirdness of older fiction, Victorian ghost stories and strangeness and so on, he used cutting-edge science in his stories, technology and cosmology that was only just beginning to be discovered, all in a similar manner to the way in which Ellis does. And this informed his stories and created a jumping-off point for his existential horror. You know, science was peeling back the wonders of the universe and the atom and all of this stuff, and he found it a bit scary, as people often do find new things scary. His work assumes that the reader can piece together clues, understand or forgive references to ancient history and mythology that may or may not even exist, and grapple with philosophical senses of irrelevance, smallness, and horror. The idea that the universe is vast, uncaring, and fundamentally unknowable, no matter how much we uncover. Overwhelming. Not to mention he assumed that people were at least passingly familiar with the new technology of the time. Aeroplanes flying over the Antarctic tundra, submarines plumbing the depths of the ocean, electrical and radiological wonders beyond the dreams of Tesla or Edison, but mostly Tesla. Peterson's Call of Cthulhu embraced these themes, giving players a world where knowledge is as much of a curse as a weapon, and where victory often means surviving with your sanity intact and nothing more. Peterson even wanted to follow Lovecraft's example, setting the original game in the modern world and making it a modern game in the way that Lovecraft stories were modern at the time. Instead, we now have alternatives like Delta Green or the Laundry Files, which do that instead. But the original Call of Cthulhu still elevates through its historical narrative and the kinds of questions and horror that it asks, that it presents. So what do all these creators have in common? I think it is that they trust their audience, or that by some other means they have come to believe that their audience can cope with things that are elevated, difficult, require a little bit of effort. They assume that readers, viewers and players are curious, intelligent, capable, robust, anti-fragile and willing to engage with deeper and more challenging themes, historical context and intellectual challenges and hypotheticals. They don't dumb things down. Even if we go to something like D&D, it's replete with the description of all manner of obscure Middle Ages polearms, and comes with a nice big list of fiction that we can delve into. So that even earlier forms of D&D, if not the current one, kind of elevate people who read it. You want to know what a gizam is, or a Bohemian ear spoon. It's got you covered, or it can send you in the right direction. It encourages you to learn if you don't understand something, if you want to understand something. We go down rabbit holes of research when we encounter something interesting in our games or our pop media, and we all benefit from that. They don't dumb things down. They don't cater to the lowest common denominator. They don't run in fear of criticism or offence, and because of that, the work endures. The best pop culture doesn't pander. It challenges. It makes you think, whether you realise it or not. And when it does, it sticks with you, and it sticks to the culture, shaping how you see other stories, the world, and maybe even yourself a little bit. So, the next time someone tells you that entertainment should be just fun, with no depth or anything more to it, that's fine, but fun has many meanings. The best fun often comes with something more along with it. There are so many different interpretations of fun. I don't like roller coasters. Lots of people do. And whatever entertainment we do have, it doesn't have to mean that it's anodyne pablum. And there's an interesting fact for you. Let's make this video educational and elevating. Pablum comes from pabulum, meaning foodstuff. And back in the day it was, and I think still is, a bland and easily digestible processed cereal food intended for babies that deliberately didn't include a lot of common allergens. It was invented in 1931, so kind of at the end of the Lovecraftian era. These days we mostly know it from that idiom, describing things as being pablum and not what it actually is. So there, you learned something. Zang. Now exit, pursued by a bear. Imagination is a deeply personal game about depression and its effects, intended to help people with invisible illnesses to broach the subject and explore it in a way in which they can have power over it. Imagination is set after the fall of mainland Britain to a strange reality breakdown. The barriers between imagination and reality, dreams and nightmares, have shattered, and strange things dreamed up by people caught in the event teem across the land. Only those whose minds are already broken can hope to cope with exploring, understanding, and combating this strangeness for the sake of the huddled refugees that sit and wait and watch from the smaller islands around the coast. A game of mental illness and art using the description system as used in Neverwhere. This game is available free, so please promote, download, host and spread as far and wide as you can. Available at post-mort.com and drive-through RPG.